The stars outside the viewport burned like cold diamonds against the endless black, and Empress Sarith Valorian stood watching them with her 4 violet eyes as the diplomatic cruiser Twilight Covenant hummed softly through the void between worlds. She was beautiful in the way her people always were, with skin like pale silver and hair that flowed like liquid starlight down her back, and she carried herself with the grace of someone born to rule empires. Her bonded consort, Prince Kaelin of the Ascendancy, had sent her on this mission to secure a trade agreement with the outer colonies, and he had given her his finest protectors to ensure her safety. The Kithrin guards surrounded her now, 6 of them standing at attention in the corridor outside her chambers, their 6-limbed bodies covered in ceremonial armor that gleamed under the ship lights. They were legendary warriors, these Kithrin, bred for combat across 10,000 generations, and bound by blood oaths so sacred that breaking them meant death and eternal shame. Sareth had never once doubted their loyalty, never once questioned whether they would give their lives for hers, because that was simply what the Kithrin did. They were protectors, and she was their charge, and the universe had always worked exactly this way. In the lower observation deck, a human sat alone cleaning his rifle with careful hands, and nobody paid him any attention because nobody ever paid attention to humans. Sergeant Marcus Cole had been assigned to this mission as part of something called the Interspecies Military Exchange Program, which was really just a polite way of saying that the Galactic Council wanted to make humanity feel included without actually giving them any real responsibility. He was 34 years old with short dark hair and eyes the color of Earth soil, and he had fought in 3 wars before he turned 25. The aliens on this ship saw him as a curiosity at best, a primitive creature from a primitive world that had only discovered faster-than-light travel a mere 2 centuries ago. They did not know about the scars hidden beneath his uniform, the memories that woke him screaming in the night, the friends he had buried in foreign soil on worlds whose names he could not pronounce. They saw a small soft creature with no claws and no telepathy and no natural armor, and they dismissed him as irrelevant. Marcus was used to being dismissed, and he had learned long ago that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage a soldier could have. The attack came without warning, as attacks so often do. One moment, the Twilight Covenant was cruising peacefully through the neutral corridor near Vaynar Station, and the next moment the ship shuddered as something massive latched onto the hull. Alarms screamed through every corridor, red lights flashing in urgent patterns that painted the walls in the color of blood. "Dominion Raiders," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, fear bleeding through his professional tone. "All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Sareth felt her hearts, she had 3 of them, begin to race as the Kithrin guard formed a protective circle around her. "We must get you to the escape pods, Your Majesty," the lead guard said, his mandibles clicking rapidly in the way they did when Kithrin were stressed. "How many ships?" Sareth asked, keeping her voice calm even as fear crawled up her spine. 7, another guard answered, checking his tactical display. "Vrethkai hunting vessels fully armed." The Vrethkai were nightmares given flesh, 7-foot reptilian mercenaries who worked for the Dominion and took pleasure in cruelty, the way other species took pleasure in art or music. They were coming for her, Sareth realized with cold certainty, because an Empress would fetch a price beyond imagination on the black market. The ship lurched again as more boarding pods attached themselves to the hull like parasites, and Sareth heard the distant sound of metal being cut, of airlocks being breached, of death coming closer with every passing second. "This way, Your Majesty," the lead Kithrin said, and they began moving through the corridors toward the escape pod bay. They were halfway there when the first Vrethkai appeared at the far end of the corridor, its yellow eyes gleaming with hunger, and its scaled body covered in weapons. The lead Kithrin opened fire immediately, and the raider fell, but more were coming, always more, pouring through the breached sections of the ship like water through a broken dam. "There are too many," one of the guards said, and there was something in his voice that made Sarith's blood run cold. She had never heard a Kithran sound afraid before. The guards exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them that Sarith did not understand, and then the lead guard turned to her with something like shame in his compound eyes. "Forgive us, Your Majesty," he said. And then they ran. Not toward the enemy, not toward glory and honor and the sacred duty they had sworn to uphold, but away toward the escape pods, toward survival, toward the betrayal of everything Sarith had believed about them. She stood frozen in disbelief as she watched her protectors abandon her, as she heard the escape pods launching one after another, as she realized that she was alone on a ship full of monsters. The Kithran blood oaths, she understood now with bitter clarity, contained clauses she had never known about, provisions for unwinnable engagements, loopholes that allowed survival over honor. She had trusted them with her life, and they had calculated the odds and found her wanting. Footsteps approached from behind her, and Sarith turned expecting to see death in reptilian form. Instead she saw the human. Marcus Cole walked toward her with his rifle raised, and his face set in an expression she could not read, and he looked at the empty corridor where her guards had stood with something like disgust. "Cowards," he said quietly, and the word carried more weight than any speech. "They left me," Sarith whispered, still unable to process the betrayal. "They swore oaths and they left me." "I know," Marcus said, and he moved past her to take position at the corridor junction, checking sight lines and defensive positions with the automatic precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "What are you doing?" she asked. "My job," he said simply. The sound of Vrethkai grew louder, closer, and Sarith could smell them now, that distinctive scent of scales and bloodlust that her people had learned to fear across millennia of conflict. "There are too many of them," she said. "You cannot possibly—" "Your Majesty," Marcus interrupted, his voice calm and steady despite everything, "get behind me." She looked at this human, this small, soft creature that her people had dismissed as primitive and irrelevant, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in the eyes of her sworn protectors. She saw someone who had already decided to die for her, not because of oaths or honor or sacred duty, but simply because she needed help and he was there. Sarith moved behind the human soldier as the first Vrethkai rounded the corner, and Marcus Cole opened fire, and the battle for the Twilight Covenant began. The first Vrethkai died before it even knew what was happening, Marcus's rifle sending a pulse of superheated plasma straight through its skull, and the creature collapsed in a heap of scales and smoking flesh. The second and third died moments later, their bodies tumbling over the first, and for just a heartbeat the raiders behind them hesitated, because they had not expected resistance. That hesitation cost them dearly. Marcus moved like water, like smoke, like something born from the nightmares that lurked in the dark spaces between stars, and his rifle sang a song of death that echoed through the corridors of the dying ship. Sarith pressed herself against the wall behind him and watched with wide eyes as this human did the impossible. She had studied the species called humanity during her education, had learned about their unremarkable homeworld and their brief history among the stars, had been told that they were soft and weak and destined to remain forever on the fringes of galactic civilization. Nobody had told her about this. Nobody had told her about the way humans could push through pain that would cripple other species, the way their bodies flooded with chemicals that turned fear into fuel, the way they fought hardest when the odds were worst. The Vrethkai kept coming, wave after wave of scaled killers pouring through the breached sections of the ship, and Marcus kept shooting them down. His rifle grew hot in his hands, the barrel glowing orange with heat, but he did not stop, could not stop, because stopping meant death for the woman behind him. "Fall back," he shouted over his shoulder. "Next junction, 20 meters." Sarith ran, her ceremonial robes tangling around her legs, and she heard Marcus's boots pounding behind her as he retreated while still firing, a technique that should have been impossible but somehow was not. They reached the junction, and Marcus immediately began overturning supply crates, building a barricade with quick, efficient movements that spoke of long practice. "How many?" Sarith gasped, her 3 hearts pounding so hard she could feel them in her throat. "Doesn't matter," Marcus said, slapping a fresh charge into his rifle. "We hold here." The HFY came again, and again Marcus met them with fire and fury. An hour passed, then 2, then 3, and the corridor in front of their barricade became a graveyard of reptilian bodies. Sarith lost count of how many fell, lost track of time itself, lost everything except the sight of this human standing between her and death. Marcus took his first wound in the 4th hour, a glancing shot that burned a furrow across his left arm, but he simply grunted and kept fighting as if the injury meant nothing. The second wound came an hour later, a blade that slipped past his guard and opened a gash across his ribs, and Sarith saw his blood for the first time, red, so impossibly red, like the emergency lights that still flashed throughout the ship. "You need medical attention," she said, reaching for him. "Later," he said, and shot another raider through the chest. The HFY were growing cautious now, hanging back at the end of the corridor and hissing to each other in their guttural language, and Sarith realized with dawning amazement that they were afraid. They were afraid of this one small human who should have died hours ago, but simply refused to do so. In the 6th hour, Marcus's rifle finally gave out, the power cell exhausted and the barrel warped from overuse, and for one terrible moment Sarith thought it was over. Then Marcus flipped the rifle around, gripping it by the barrel, and charged forward with a scream that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. He used the rifle as a club, smashing it into scaled faces and armored bodies, and when the rifle shattered, he picked up a jagged piece of hull plating that had been torn loose during the boarding, and used that instead. The HFY had never seen anything like it. They were warriors, professional killers who had ended countless lives across dozens of worlds, and they could not understand what they were facing. This human was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his uniform soaked in his own red blood, and still he fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. One of the raiders managed to sink its claws into Marcus's shoulder, tearing through muscle and scraping bone, and Marcus responded by driving his improvised blade through the creature's eye socket. They fell together, human and reptile, and for a long moment neither moved. Sarith scrambled over the barricade, ignoring the danger, ignoring everything except the need to reach the man who had saved her life 100 times over in the past 6 hours. "Marcus," she said, rolling the dead HFY off him, "Marcus, can you hear me?" He groaned and opened his eyes, and somehow impossibly he smiled. "Still alive," he said, his voice rough with pain. "Told you we'd hold." Sarith looked around at the corridor, at the bodies stacked 3 deep, at the violet HFY blood that painted the walls and ceiling and floor, and she felt something she had never felt before. She felt awe. 23, she whispered, counting the dead. "You killed 23 of them." "Lost count," Marcus admitted, and he tried to sit up but his body finally betrayed him and he collapsed back against the deck. Sarith tore strips from her ceremonial robes and began binding his wounds with shaking hands, and she noticed that his skin was cold to the touch, colder than it should be. "You've lost too much blood," she said. "You need to stay awake," he interrupted. "More might come." "You've killed them all," she said. "The ones on this section at least, you've killed them all." Marcus shook his head slowly, wincing at the movement. "Ship's big," he said. "More sections, more boarding parties we need to move, find somewhere defensible somewhere." He tried to stand and his legs buckled, and Sarith caught him before he could fall, his weight heavy against her slender frame. "Why?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the first shot was fired. "Why did you stay when my own guards ran?" Marcus looked at her with those strange earth-colored eyes, and she saw exhaustion there, and pain, and something else she could not name. "Didn't need an oath," he said quietly. "You needed help." Sareth felt tears forming in her eyes, an emotional response that her people considered primitive and embarrassing, but she did not care. This human, this stranger from a species her people barely acknowledged, had given more for her in 6 hours than her sworn protectors had given in 6 years. "Can you walk?" she asked, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Can try," he said. Together they moved deeper into the ship, the Empress and the soldier, searching for safety in a vessel full of monsters, and behind them the corridor stood silent except for the hum of failing systems and the drip of blood from the walls. The battle for the Twilight Covenant was far from over, but something had changed in the spaces between heartbeats. Sareth had seen true loyalty for the first time in her life, and she would never forget the face of the man who had shown it to her. They found refuge in a storage compartment deep in the belly of the ship, a small room lined with emergency supplies that had somehow escaped the notice of the raiders. Marcus collapsed against the wall as soon as Sareth sealed the door behind them, and for a terrible moment she thought he had died, but then his chest rose and fell and she allowed herself to breathe again. The next few hours were a blur of medical kits and emergency procedures, of Sareth following the instructions on human first aid guides with trembling hands, while Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness. She sealed his wounds with medical foam, injected him with antibiotics designed for human biology, and prayed to gods she was not sure she believed in that it would be enough. When she finally finished, Marcus was sleeping deeply and Sareth was covered in his blood, and she sat in the corner of the storage room and tried to process everything that had happened. The ship's engines were dead, destroyed during the initial attack or perhaps deliberately sabotaged by the fleeing crew, and the Twilight Covenant drifted through the void like a ghost vessel. Life support was failing slowly, the air recyclers working at reduced capacity, and Sareth calculated that they had perhaps 2 weeks before the oxygen ran out entirely. The distress beacon was active, broadcasting their location to anyone who might be listening, but space was vast and rescue was never guaranteed. For 11 days they drifted between the stars, and in that time Sareth learned more about humanity than all her years of formal education had taught her. Marcus recovered slowly, his human body knitting itself back together with a stubbornness that mirrored his spirit, and as his strength returned, he began to talk. He told her about Earth, about a blue planet with vast oceans and green forests and creatures of every shape and size imaginable. He told her about human history, about a species that had spent most of its existence trying to kill itself, that had invented 1,000 ways to wage war before ever learning to reach the stars. He told her about the wars he had fought, the friends he had lost, the nightmares that still haunted him when he closed his eyes. "We're not special," he admitted one night as they shared a meal of emergency rations. "We don't have telepathy or natural armor or any of the things that make other species powerful. We just don't know how to quit." Sareth thought about the Kithrin Guard, about their blood oaths and their sacred honor, about how quickly they had abandoned both when faced with death. "Perhaps that is what makes you special," she said. Marcus shrugged, and Sareth had learned by now that humans used this gesture when they did not know how to respond to compliments. The days passed slowly in the drifting ship, and Sareth found herself looking forward to their conversations in a way that surprised her. Marcus was not like the nobles she had spent her life surrounded by, not full of empty flattery and political calculations, and when he spoke to her as an equal rather than as an empress. He rationed their supplies with careful precision, always giving her the larger portion of food and water despite her protests. "You need it more than I do," he would say. and no amount of argument could change his mind. On the 5th day, the heating system failed, and the storage compartment grew cold enough that Sarith could see her breath forming clouds in the air. Marcus gave her his jacket without being asked, wrapping it around her shoulders even though he shivered in his thin undershirt. "Humans can handle cold," he said when she tried to return it. "We evolved on a planet with ice ages. This is nothing." She knew he was lying, knew that he was suffering for her sake, but she also knew that arguing would accomplish nothing. On the 8th day, the oxygen levels began to drop faster than expected, and Marcus studied the readouts with a grim expression that made Sarith's heart ache. "Air recyclers failing faster than I thought," he said. "We have maybe 3 days left instead of 9. "The rescue," Sarith began. "Might come," Marcus said. "Might not. We need to prepare for both." He spent the next several hours working with the emergency equipment, and when he finished, he showed Sarith a small personal oxygen supply that he had salvaged from one of the emergency suits. "This will give you an extra 12 hours, he said. "Use it when the main supply runs out." Sarith looked at the oxygen supply and then looked at Marcus, and she understood immediately what he was planning. "No," she said firmly. "Your Majesty." "I said no," she repeated. "I will not survive by taking your breath. I will not watch you die so that I might live a few hours longer." Marcus smiled, and there was something sad in the expression. "It's not about hours," he said gently. "Rescue could come any moment, and if you have extra oxygen, you have extra chances. It's simple math." "Mathematics does not measure the worth of a life," Sarith said. "No," Marcus agreed, "but it does measure probabilities, and right now the probability is that one of us can survive and one of us cannot, and if I have to choose—" "You do not have to choose," Sarith interrupted. "I am the Empress and I forbid you from sacrificing yourself for me." Marcus laughed, a quiet sound that somehow contained no bitterness. "With all due respect, Your Majesty," he said, "I don't think my orders come from you." On the 11th day, the air grew thin enough that breathing became difficult, and Sarith watched Marcus struggle to stay awake as his body starved for oxygen. "Use the supply," she begged him. "Please, just this once, think of yourself." "Can't," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Promised I'd keep you alive." "You promised nothing," Sarith said, tears streaming down her face. "You swore no oaths. You owe me nothing." Marcus reached out and took her hand, his grip weak but warm. "Rescue will come," he said. Tell them humans keep their promises." He pressed the personal oxygen supply into her hands, and before she could protest, he slumped sideways, his eyes closing, his breath stopping. Sarith screamed his name, shook his shoulders, pressed her ear to his chest, and heard nothing but silence. The human soldier who had fought an army for her, who had given his food and his warmth and finally his breath for her, was dead. She held his body and wept, alone in the cold dark between the stars, and she cursed the gods and the universe and the cowardly guards who had brought them to this moment. And then, as if answering her grief, a light appeared through the viewport, the running lights of a Galactic Union patrol ship responding to the distress beacon. Rescue had come, just as Marcus had said it would. But it had come too late. Or so Sarith thought. The medical team from the Galactic Union patrol ship burst through the sealed door within minutes of docking, their equipment humming with advanced technology designed to save lives across 100 different species. Sarith refused to let go of Marcus's body even as they tried to pull her away, her silver fingers locked around his cold hand. "He's dead," one of the medics said, a Lorathi with pale blue skin and 6 eyes that blinked in sequence. "Human male, oxygen deprivation, cardiac arrest, time of death approximately." "Save him," Sarith commanded, and her voice carried the weight of imperial authority despite her ragged appearance. "Your Majesty, he has no heartbeat. His brain has been without oxygen for at least 4 minutes. There is nothing." "I am Empress Valorian, bonded consort to Prince Kalen of the Ascendancy," she said, rising to her full height. "And I am telling you to save this man, or I will have your entire species banned from every trade route in the Empire. Now do your job." The Lorathi medic hesitated for only a moment before ordering his team into action, and they surrounded Marcus's body with equipment that Sarith did not recognize. Electricity coursed through his chest, chemicals pumped into his veins, machines forced air into his lungs and blood through his heart, and for long, terrible minutes nothing happened. The medics exchanged glances that spoke of failure and resignation, and Sarith felt her hopes crumbling like ancient stone. And then Marcus's heart started beating. It was weak at first, irregular and uncertain, but it was a heartbeat where there had been silence, life where there had been death. "Impossible," the Lorathi medic breathed, staring at his readouts in disbelief. "He was dead for 4 minutes, his neural activity should be." Marcus coughed, a violent sound that shook his whole body, and his eyes fluttered open. "What?" he rasped, his voice like gravel. "What happened?" Sarith laughed and cried at the same time, emotions overwhelming her in ways she had never experienced before. "You died," she said. "You died and came back." "Oh," Marcus said, as if this was only mildly interesting, "that's happened before." The Lorathi medic made a sound of pure frustration and threw his hands up in surrender. "Humans," he muttered as his team loaded Marcus onto a stretcher. "They simply do not respect the concept of death." The rescue ship carried them to safety, and within hours the message had spread across the sector that Empress Sarith was alive and aboard a Union vessel heading for the capital. Prince Kalen's fleet arrived the next day, 100 warships that had been dispatched the moment news of the attack reached the Ascendancy, and the prince himself came aboard to retrieve his bonded consort. He was tall and elegant, Prince Kalen, with features that artists had painted for centuries, and a bearing that spoke of ancient nobility. He embraced Sarith with genuine relief, and then turned to survey the crew that surrounded them. "Where is your guard?" he asked. "I wish to commend them for protecting you." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. "My guard," Sarith said, and her voice was ice, "fled like cowards the moment the attack began. They abandoned me to die, every single one of them." Prince Kalen's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to cold fury. "That is impossible," he said. "The Kithran blood oath is unbreakable. They would never." "They did," Sarith interrupted. "Their oaths contained clauses I never knew about, provisions for unwinnable engagements, loopholes that allowed them to preserve their own lives while sacrificing mine." "Then how?" the prince began. "One person stayed," Sarith said, and she turned to gesture at the medical bay where Marcus was recovering. "The human soldier, the one we dismissed as a political formality. He held a corridor against 23 Vrethkai raiders for 6 hours. He gave me his food and his warmth during the 11 days we drifted through space. He gave me his oxygen when the air ran out. He died for me, and then refused to stay dead." The assembled nobles stared at her in stunned silence, their worldviews cracking under the weight of her words. "A human," one of them said, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "A human," Sarith confirmed, "and he showed more honor in 11 days than the Kithran showed in 6 years of service." What followed was the largest scandal to rock the Ascendancy in 300 years. The Kithran Guard were summoned before the imperial court, and they came in shame, their compound eyes unable to meet the gaze of the Empress they had betrayed. Sarith's testimony was broadcast across 1,000 worlds, her words painting a picture of cowardice and broken oaths that destroyed centuries of Kithran reputation in a single afternoon. The guards were stripped of their titles, their armor, their honor, and banished to the outer reaches of known space where they would live out their days in disgrace. But that was only the beginning. Sarith stood before the full assembly of Ascendancy nobility and delivered a speech that would be remembered for generations. "We have dismissed humanity as primitive," she said. "We have called them evolutionary accidents. We have treated them as curiosities unworthy of respect, and we were wrong. We were so terribly wrong." She spoke of Marcus Cole, of his courage and his sacrifice, of the way he had fought without oaths or promises or hope of reward. "True loyalty is not bred or sworn," she concluded. "It is chosen in the moments when it matters most, and this human chose loyalty when my own people chose fear." The assembly voted unanimously to formally recognize humanity as equals within the galactic community, a status that dozens of species had spent millennia trying to achieve. And then came the matter of Sergeant Marcus Cole himself. He stood before the imperial court wrapped in regeneration bandages, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, his human eyes scanning for exits like a trapped animal. Prince Kalen descended from his throne and stood before the human soldier. "You saved what my own people abandoned," the prince said, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. "You defended my bonded consort when her sworn protectors fled. You gave your life for hers and then returned from death itself to continue your vigil. Name your reward, Sergeant Cole. Anything within my power to grant is yours." Marcus shifted his weight awkwardly and cleared his throat. "Just doing my job, Your Highness," he said. "Don't need a reward for that." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles, confusion and amazement mixing in equal measure. Sarith stepped forward, her violet eyes fixed on the human who had become her savior. "Then I shall name it for him," she said, and her voice rang with authority. "I invoke the right of Guardian's Bond, a tradition older than the ascendancy itself. This human will serve as my personal protector, answerable to no one but me, bound by no oath except his own conscience." The court gasped, because the right of Guardian's Bond had never been extended to an off-worlder, had never been offered to anyone outside the noble houses, had certainly never been given to a member of a species that most had considered barely civilized. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, "I'm not sure that's—" "You kept me alive," Sarith said quietly, stepping close enough that only he could hear. "Now I intend to keep you." And for the first time since they had met, Marcus Cole had no argument to offer. The story spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass, carried on trade ships and diplomatic vessels, and the whispered conversations of 1,000 different species. They called it the Twilight Covenant Incident at first, a dry, bureaucratic name that failed to capture the wonder of what had actually happened. But as the tale traveled from world to world, it became something else, something larger, something that changed the way the galaxy viewed a small species from an unremarkable planet called Earth. The story of the human soldier, they called it, or sometimes simply the Guardian's tale. Children on distant worlds grew up hearing about Marcus Cole, about the man who fought 23 raiders with nothing but a rifle and his refusal to surrender, who died and came back because he had promised to keep someone safe. Military academies began studying human combat tactics, trying to understand how a species with no natural weapons could produce warriors of such terrifying effectiveness. The secret, their researchers eventually concluded, was not physical at all. Humans were dangerous because they did not calculate odds the way other species did, because their brains flooded with chemicals that turned fear into fuel, because they had evolved on a death world where the only way to survive was to be more stubborn than the things trying to kill you. "Never corner a human" became a saying that spread across trading posts and military installations throughout known space. They do not know when they are beaten, and that makes them dangerous. Ambassadors from major powers began requesting human security details, not because humans were the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but because humans could be trusted to stay when others would run. Warlords and pirates who had once dismissed human vessels as easy prey began giving them wide berth, because nobody wanted to be the next cautionary tale about underestimating humanity. And at the center of this cultural earthquake stood Marcus Cole, who remained deeply uncomfortable with his newfound fame. 5 years had passed since the Twilight Covenant, and Marcus had spent every one of them at Sarith's side, a constant presence in the glittering chaos of Ascendancy court life. He hated the ceremonies, hated the speeches, hated the way nobles who had once looked down on him now scrambled to win his favor. But he stayed because Sarith had asked him to stay, and Marcus Cole kept his promises. The relationship between the human soldier and the alien Empress had become the subject of countless songs and stories, romanticized beyond recognition by artists who had never met either of them. The truth was simpler and more profound than any romance. They were friends, genuine friends, in a world where friendship was rare, and trust was rarer still. Sarith had learned to read Marcus's silences, to understand the weight of memories he carried, to give him space when the nightmares came and companionship, when the silence grew too heavy. Marcus had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics, to spot threats before they materialized, to be the steady presence that Sarith needed when the demands of her position became overwhelming. They complemented each other in ways that neither had expected. The Empress who had been taught that worth was measured in genetics, and the soldier who had never been taught to measure worth at all. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, Sarith hosted a gathering of dignitaries from across the galaxy, a celebration of the new era of cooperation that had begun with her rescue. Humans were everywhere at the gathering, no longer tokens or curiosities, but valued members of the galactic community. Sarith watched them mingle with species that had once dismissed them, and she felt a pride that was almost maternal. "You're thinking too loud," Marcus said from his position beside her, his eyes scanning the crowd for threats out of habit. "I'm thinking about how much has changed," she said. 5 years ago these people would not have looked twice at a human. Now they seek your opinions, your friendships, your alliances." "Still just soldiers and explorers," Marcus said with a shrug, "same as always." "No," Sarith disagreed. "Not the same. You have shown them something new. You have shown them that strength is not measured in size or weapons or ancient bloodlines. You have shown them that the smallest species can stand the tallest when it matters." Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching a group of human diplomats engaged in animated conversation with representatives from 3 different species. "We just want to belong," he said finally. "That's all humanity has ever wanted, to find our place among the stars, to prove we deserve to be here." "You have proved that," Sarith said, 1,000 times over." Later that evening, after the dignitaries had departed and the great hall stood empty, Sarith and Marcus walked together through the palace gardens. The stars shone overhead, the same cold diamonds that Sarith had watched through the viewport of the Twilight Covenant on that terrible night 5 years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" "Staying," she said. "Fighting, dying, all of it. If you had fled with the Kithrin you would have lived, you would have gone back to Earth, lived a normal life." Marcus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. Even the dying part." "Especially the dying part," he said, and there was a hint of a smile on his face. "Dying is easy. Living with yourself after running away, that would have been the hard part." Sarith stopped walking and turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his face. "You are a strange species," she said. "I know. You rush toward danger when any sensible creature would run." "Guilty." "You form attachments to strangers and defend them as fiercely as family." "Also guilty." "And you refuse to stay dead, even when biology and physics demand it." Marcus grinned, and it transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. "That's just stubbornness," he said. "Humans are very good at stubborn." Sarith laughed, a genuine sound that she rarely allowed herself in public. "I am glad you are stubborn," she said. "I am glad you stayed, I am glad you came back, and I am glad you are here with me, despite all the reasons you should not be. Nowhere else I'd rather be, Your Majesty." They stood together in the garden, the Empress and her guardian, watching the stars that had once seemed so cold and uncaring. The galaxy was vast and ancient and full of wonders that neither of them would ever fully understand. But they had found something rare in each other. They had found loyalty that was not sworn but chosen, friendship that was not calculated but genuine, trust that had been forged in fire and death, and the long cold drift between the stars. And somewhere across the galaxy, on 1,000 different worlds, other humans were proving themselves worthy of the same trust, one small act of courage at a time. Humanity had arrived among the stars, and they were exactly what the galaxy needed. Not the strongest species, not the oldest, not the most advanced. Just the most stubborn, the most loyal, the most unwilling to give up when giving up would have been easier. And sometimes Sarith had learned that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. She reached out and took Marcus's hand, a gesture of friendship and gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them needed to name. "Thank you," she said, "for being human." Marcus squeezed her hand in return. "Thank you for being worth being human for." And together they walked back toward the palace, two small figures against the infinite dark, bound by something stronger than oaths or blood or ancient law. Bound by choice. Bound by loyalty. Bound by the simple truth that sometimes the smallest soldier in the galaxy stands the tallest. And the stars, cold and ancient and eternal, watched over them in silence, witnesses to a friendship that would echo through history long after both of them were gone.